Hey, this is Professor Fay with your anatomy lesson of the day. Today we're going to talk about the atlas and the axis, which are cervical vertebrae C1 and C2. So here's a look at the atlas. This is cervical vertebra C1. This is your first vertebrae. Now, it's named for the Greek god who carried the world on his shoulders because it's got these superior articular facets here, which are kind of elongated and curved out. They articulate with the skull's occipital condyles. So here's a look at the skull. I'm going to tip it over, and there's the occipital condyles on the skull right by the foramen magnum. So we'll take the atlas and pair it up with the skull, and there's our joint. Some other notable features on the atlas are that it's got transverse processes, and in there you can see transverse foramen, and you can see the vertebral foramen. This is called a posterior arch with a posterior tubercle and an anterior arch with the anterior tubercle. And then if we look at the inferior surface of the atlas, you can see we've got inferior articular facets, which articulate with the axis, the next cervical vertebrae. So here's a look at the axis. All right. So it's got this dens, which is also called the odontoid process. Both of those mean tooth. So this tooth-like structure is how the axis got its name. And if we put the inferior articular facets of the atlas joined up with the superior articular facets of the axis, we get that articulation. And this is the reason we can do no with our head. All right, so between these two bones in the skull, the reason we can do yes and no falls with these points of articulation that we've talked about today. A few other notable things about the axis is that there are transverse processes, and those transverse processes do have transverse foramen in them. Those foramen are important. You'll find them in all cervical vertebrae so that arteries, veins, and nerves can get to and from our head. There's the big vertebral foramen from the transverse processes moving posteriorly. We've got lamina and then a spinous process. And so that is the atlas and axis. Some important landmarks on them to note for our class.